Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. Undocumented, illegal alien, illegal immigrant, whatever word you use, you typically don't think of a Dominican kid that went from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League.
I had intense frustrations with where we lived. I was always worrying about my physical safety. I wanted to be in spaces that allowed me to be my truest self. I needed to look beyond my neighborhood if necessary.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. Danel Padilla's family came to the United States legally on a temporary visa so his mother could get treatment for a complicated pregnancy. But then they stayed, and since they didn't have legal status, they fell on hard times financially. They went from a homeless shelter to the projects in East Harlem. But Danel always did well in school. So well, he gained entrance and a scholarship to an elite prep school, then to Princeton, where he graduated at the top of his class. He's written a memoir called Undocumented. Danel, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what's your legal status now?
My legal status right now is in the hands of the United States Immigration Service. So I have been in the United States legally since I re-entered from the United Kingdom in 2007. I had a student visa to study at Stanford University for my PhD, and after the student visa term expired, I was given a work authorization to take up a postdoc at Columbia University. My longtime girlfriend and I got married in the spring of 2015, after which she and I submitted what's called a concurrent filing for my green card. Since May of 2015, this application has been in USCIS's hands, but they have not yet pronounced on it. The newest development is that the Immigration Service has in fact requested that I apply for what's called a waiver of inadmissibility. Because I resided out of status in the United States from my childhood and young adulthood until the age of 21. I have been deemed inadmissible according to the language governing this transition to green card status. What that means in my case is that until and unless I can show to the satisfaction of the Immigration Service that my removal from the United States would cause extreme hardship to my U.S. citizen wife, I won't be granted my green card. So in order to make this case, my wife and I submitted the other week a very, very long application that consisted of a 7-page cover letter, 2 affidavits, one from her and one from my now U.S. citizen mom, and about 90 pages of supporting materials. And that is where things currently stand.
So you were 4 years old when you came from Dominican Republic. You've never gone back.
That's right.
Because you couldn't. If you'd gone back, they would have never let you back into the United States. Right. How old were you when you realized that you and your mother did not have legal status to stay in the United States?
The realization came in bits and pieces. So I knew already within the first 2-3 years of our time in the States that there was something wrong. That my parents were discussing our immigration status problem, and they were having conversations, some of which I overheard. Couldn't really make sense of why they were so anxious about it, but I understood that there was a problem and that it needed to be resolved. The first time it dawned on me that there were some pretty serious obstructions that my brother, my mom, and I would have to face as a result of my mother and I not being in status, occurred when my grandfather died. He suddenly passed away, and my mom explained to me when I asked her why we weren't traveling back to the Dominican Republic for his funeral, that we couldn't leave the United States because were we to leave, we would not be allowed back. And so that's when something snapped into focus. I became aware that our status problem made it difficult for us to travel. But then I also began to realize that our status problem made it difficult for Mom and for me to work. And that's another realization that helped bring into stark relief just what it meant to be undocumented.
Now, when you were 7 years old, your father decided he's going back to Dominican Republic, but your mom said no. Why did she decide that she wanted to stay?
The 2 main reasons she shared with my dad were first, that she believed firmly that my younger brother and I deserved the opportunities of a U.S. education. And second, that she felt really unsafe in the Dominican Republic. When I had been a kid before we came over to the States, our house had been broken into. My mom had received some pretty menacing threats while she was an employee at a pensioners fund in Santo Domingo. And she had these anxieties about our physical security. And she felt much safer, even given the neighborhoods we were living in at the time in New York City, in the States than she would have or she did in Santo Domingo. The other reasons all had to do with her sense of feeling that it was in America that, in fact, her vision for us could come to fruition. And some of that was linked up with education, as I mentioned earlier, but a lot of that simply had to do with a commitment to the kinds of robust democratic practices that came to matter so much to her and that made her believe in being here in the first place.
But couldn't she have gone back when the visa was up and then applied just through regular legal channels to come back?
So after my brother was born, she had a medical setback. The second consideration, and something that my parents really agonized over when they realized its full implications, was that by the time they were in a position to sort of fully recognize the extent of their problem, they had absolutely no resources with which to address it. So when they had been talking about our legal status in the country, a few months after my brother had been born, they realized, look, we need to change our status. And they asked around. They had relatives in the States, and so they said, look, is there anyone who could give us guidance, anyone who could give us advice? And they were eventually put in touch with someone who claimed to be an expert on immigration issues. And so they paid him a very hefty amount of money from what they had been able to save up, and there was no resolution to the immigration issues. This man disappeared, and at no point did my parents ever hear back from the Immigration Service because no application had been filed, right? And once they were in a position to come to grips with this, after initially being incredibly angry that this had happened to them, they had to reckon with some of the implications. They no longer had jobs in the Dominican Republic, right? So they would have had no economic stability had they returned. They didn't have any money. They had spent most of it in this ill-starred pursuit of status through this person who turned out to be a charlatan. And they now had two little kids. And my mom was still recovering from her medical setbacks. So all of those conspired to make it really difficult at the time, or even in the year or two or three after, to head back to the Dominican Republic and try to acquire status by re-entering the U.S.
How did you guys end up homeless?
So after my dad left, my mom tried to make ends meet on her own for a few months. But this proved extremely difficult to do, in part because she was undocumented and she didn't have work authorization. So eventually we were evicted from our apartment in Queens. Once we were evicted, my mom first called around to see if there might be anyone who had a spare room or a spare basement, and one of her friends did have a spare basement, and so we went to live in that basement, and we stayed there for a few weeks until the basement flooded. And it was at that point that my mom decided we have to go into the shelter system. She didn't really see any other way of dealing with the situation.
So what was the condition of the homeless shelter?
So we were in two homeless shelters. The first one in Chinatown was in pretty grim conditions our entire time there. It was not particularly well kept. There were these mini epidemics of disease that swept through the shelter. Tuberculosis was the one that hit my mom, and that contributed to her spending almost 2 months basically incapacitated. Chickenpox hit me, and on top of all of those conditions, there were these day-to-day issues that my mom found incredibly vexing to deal and work around. The condition of the bathrooms was something that I can certainly remember very vividly, and that my brother also remembers. My mom lobbied to be allowed to go with us into the bathroom so that she could supervise us while we showered. She was very worried about some of the stories that were circulating in the shelter about what happened in the bathroom.
In the men's room.
In the men's room.
Because these were communal,
right.
Like go down the hall, use the shower kind of thing.
Right. She told us that if anything were to happen, we were just to scream as loud as we could. There was, however, one redeeming feature of the Chinatown shelter, which had been converted from a public school building, and it was that it had a library. and I spent a great deal of time in that library.
And you have always loved to read. What kind of books were you reading?
I was reading everything I could get my hands on at the time. From the earliest moments I can recall, have been hugely into history. And when I was in the shelter, I became incredibly obsessed with ancient history because there was this fantastic book that I happened to see on one of the shelves one day titled How People Lived in Ancient Greece and Rome. With that book in hand, I could imagine myself in all of these very different spaces.
Is that why it appealed to you? Because it was so different from your day-to-day life?
Oh, yes. I mean, it was the possibility of vaulting myself into a completely different space that first captivated me as I read these books. In time, I began to realize that as this book itself pronounced on its opening pages, there was a legacy of this world that inhabited our own world, that was shaping my own life. Why was I a Spanish speaker? What did it mean to speak Spanish, for example? Well, this language descends from Latin, and Latin was a language that was spoken by Romans. I mean, these kinds of questions over time really became fascinating and captivating for me. But it was just that imaginative escape that catapulted me into studying the classical.
So after staying in the shelter, then you were moved into public housing in East Harlem. What was the condition of the public school there?
The housing arrangement we had was that we were basically set up with a voucher to an apartment building that was owned by the city, and it placed us within a few blocks of PS 200 in Central Harlem. PS 200 was at the time undergoing pretty serious demographic transition. We were not the only Latino family in the area. There were now a lot of Dominican families in particular who were trickling down from Washington Heights into Central Harlem, and who were also just coming in as new arrivals to Central Harlem. The school was pretty rowdy and fairly violent. And this school district and this stretch of Central Harlem in particular had to deal with a lot of crime in the mid to late 90s, which was when I was living there and growing up there. I felt acutely concerned as I realized what it was to live in this neighborhood about my own physical well-being. And some of that came out of my own less than fortunate encounters with some of the neighborhood bullies.
Why were you bullied? Was it because you were smart?
It would be easy to say that, but I think things were a little more complicated. There was certainly, at least among some of them, an effort to single me out because I spoke up in the classroom in a particular way or whatever. But I mean, some of these—
It's okay to say you were smart.
No, but I say this because as I slowly discovered when I was in middle school and then really discovered when I was older, many of them were smart too, but I mean, we were all being socialized into a set of behaviors that
it wasn't cool to be smart.
That it wasn't quite so cool to be this way. The other factor behind my being singled out had to do with the fact that I would make some trouble for myself because I wasn't shy about voicing my disagreements with people. And this meant that sometimes disagreements would escalate. But the escalation factor in these kinds of environments was one that came with a very sharp edge.
You could have gotten shot, you could have gotten stabbed.
And I knew people who got shot, and I knew people who got stabbed. So on the one hand, I was always worrying about my physical safety. On the other hand, I also felt that I wanted to be in spaces that allowed me to be my truest self. And to that end, I needed to look beyond my neighborhood if necessary.
So at the summer after 4th grade, you meet a guy named Jeff. This is a white guy who's like kind of doing arts work for inner city kids. And he has you translate to your mom. And he says this, he says, quote, "Your son must have the best education possible. I believe he will go on to do great things. I want to help you make that happen." This is now a really turning point for you.
He was an incredible figure. In the course of his volunteer work at the second shelter in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where we lived, he had come across me while I was reading one day. And
reading Napoleon
in
the corner.
Yeah, reading a biography of Napoleon. See, my ambitions were of a particular sort. And he was determined, as he had me express to my mom, to secure me the best educational opportunities that he could. Now, he had a very specific conception of those opportunities. He was an elite prep school product. One of the goals he set for me and for my family was admission to one of these elite prep schools. And he was indispensable in helping us navigate the system about which we knew nothing. And I can't stress enough how little we knew about not just elite prep schooling, but education in New York City and in the States in general, right? Yeah. So he was the one who opened the door. He was the one who made everything that has happened since possible.
So you did start going to collegiate prep school starting in 7th grade. This is now in the nice part of town with the wealthier kids. What did you tell your classmates about your home life?
I was very selective in what I told them about my home life. It helped, or did not help, that some of them had assumptions that I was more than happy to confirm them in. I discovered, practically within a few days of arriving at collegiate, that because I lived in Harlem, some students thought that I was exceptionally conversant in all things Harlem, all things black, right? With Harlem and black being rendered equivalent to each other. And so that meant that for some, I was by default a sort of expert on hip hop, for example. But more than anything, I didn't want them to know just how poor we were, because some of the aspects of our poverty were ones that I thought sort of defied my ability to express. I couldn't tell them how frustrating it was to spend all these hours and weeks dealing with public assistance. I didn't want to tell them about the condition of my apartment, and I never invited any of my classmates to my apartment. Those were some of the difficulties there.
You say this in your book: I hated the poverty that had forced my family to live in buildings where the lights went out and the tap water ran brown, where the crack addicts stumbled down the staircases and the dice rollers didn't budge from the front entrance. I hated getting punched on a basketball court, running away from hood rats, riding urine-soaked elevators in the projects. Hated all that. Wanted better, so much better.
I had intense frustrations with where we lived. And
you were also now living in two kind of worlds, right? The prep school world and the Harlem world, where one of your friends joins one of the Latin gangs, and a lot of friends actually joined the gangs.
Right, and as we grew older, some of my neighborhood friends and I realized that we were parting ways, and making sense of that, and trying to understand why they were making the choices that they were making, why I was making the choices that I was making, took up a great deal of my thinking energies as an adolescent and young adult.
But you knew very early on, probably, that education was your ticket out of that world.
I had a slightly paradoxical or sort of ambivalent position on education. On the one hand, I knew, and I mean, I had internalized all of my mom's lectures to this effect, so I'd become convinced that education was in fact the way out. On the other hand, I had significant reservations about what it might mean to leave the ghetto or whatever. And so those reservations all had to do with my growing sense that to leave without ever thinking of myself as someone who could be in a position to sort of come back or give back would in essence amount to an abdication of responsibility. So as I grew older, this became a very strong sentiment. And both my brother and I eventually sort of came to share this sentiment. And the sentiment at its core had to do with a sense of recalibrating our moral and ethical responsibilities to the places that reared us.
You were accepted early decision into Princeton with a full scholarship. One of your classmates kind of intimated that you got in because of the color of your skin.
Kind of intimated. I would say
okay, he said it flat out.
explicitly stated that this had been the reason why. So I had completely tuned him out when he was complaining about his prospects for college admission, partly because I saw in him a version of the same kind of privilege that I had grown deeply, deeply resistant to by the time I was high school senior. Here he was, this child of the moneyed who was complaining to me about how his parental resources and his family's connections weren't going to be enough to get him into the school of his choice. And so I was just impatient. And then I became even more impatient and angry when he explicitly stated that I had gotten in, or things had been easier for me because of my skin color. But in the aftermath of that incident, I found it very hard to arrive at a precise articulation of what it was that had made me so angry with him. Was it that I was sort of second-guessing my own merit? Was it that I wanted to take up with him the whole question of what it means to have an affirmative action style system. Was it that I was chafing at his inability to understand that it was precisely my skin color and the background and experiences that had been structured around my racialization that had made me deserving of admission to this place? Those were some of the questions that I
Are
had.
you in favor of affirmative action, though?
Absolutely.
While you were at Princeton, you didn't tell even your closest friends that you were undocumented. Why did you keep that a secret, and why did you decide in your last year to go public?
I kept it a secret for a few reasons. Possibly the most salient was that I didn't really think they would understand. For many of my friends, migratory experiences were not something they had to deal with on a daily basis. I mean, there were a few, who were either immigrants themselves or who were the children of immigrants, but it just didn't seem obvious to me how I would distill my sort of life as an immigrant to them in a way that they could understand. And I also didn't want them to begin freaking out if and when I did sort of lapse into these moments of paranoia about my status in the States and say, well, maybe I am going to be deported. I mean, who knows what's going to happen to me? I didn't want them to stress out about me in this way.
Tell us about the DREAM Act.
So the DREAM Act is a piece of legislation that would have provided temporary work authorization and possibly a path to legalization for undocumented youth who checked off certain criteria. So different iterations of the DREAM Act have seen some wrinkles in the criteria, but this is the essential idea. The DREAM Act has, shockingly, not been passed, and it's not been passed for
years.
Years. We are now, 15 years removed from its first introduction in Congress. The closest it came was when it managed to clear the House, but did not clear the Senate.
Didn't even go to a vote
right.
in the Senate. So how do you respond to people who say, look, the law's the law, your family overstayed a visa, they should have gone back, done things legally, you should probably go back to the Dominican Republic and go through the paperwork you need to go through?
My response to that is threefold. So first, many of us from all walks of life acknowledge that there are disconnects between the law and justice. So what I'm calling for, what many immigration advocates have been calling for, is for more attention to justice, right? So how do we reimagine the laws to be as just and as ethical as they can be? With that, I go to the second prong, which is that folks who say, well, you should just go back and do the paperwork there, have, I think, a somewhat limited understanding of what this paperwork is. So I can speak, obviously, on my own behalf, but I've also spent a lot of time with undocumented families and students. We have spent many, many years filling out paperwork of all kinds. And it just so happens that because of the current setup of the laws, this paperwork does not bring us closer to getting legalization and then ultimately full residence, permanent residence citizenship in the States. So it's not as if we have somehow been unwilling or too lazy to fill out this paperwork, to commit ourselves to a process. It's that there is no process at the moment that would enable the majority of the undocumented to obtain legalization. This would apply even if the majority of the undocumented were to either voluntarily deport themselves or to be deported. Because as of right now, given the current constraints on the visa cap system and given how, in fact, the allocation of immigrant visas works, it would be extremely unlikely on a statistical basis for many of these folks to then re-enter the country legally. Barring some kind of sponsorship, this doesn't happen.
You're a college professor. Nobody wants to see you deported. I mean, you're contributing to society, but aren't you a very special case? I mean, aren't the majority of the undocumented not contributing to society?
So this is where we get to the question of what it is that the undocumented contribute. So I don't think I'm that special case at all. And there are several reasons why I think this. The first is that the undocumented pay a lot in the way of taxes. Undocumented immigrants pay somewhere in the vicinity of $12 billion in federal taxes a year.
Even though they're undocumented,
Correct.
they're still paying taxes.
They are still paying taxes because many of them are having taxes withheld.
But they're not allowed to work, so how are they having taxes withheld?
They are working. And of course, one could have a number that allows one to file for taxes even if one doesn't have a social security number, an ITIN. So there's that aspect to it. The undocumented contribute in taxes at the federal level and also in state and local taxes. The point there, though, is to emphasize that the undocumented are already contributing monetarily to the U.S. in ways that extend beyond their immediate economic impact, right? I mean, we know that they are also labor. Right, and folks have said and will continue to say that the undocumented take away jobs from American-born citizens, even though the evidence for this is at best mixed, and more likely than not, it's not even the case at all that it works like this. But the other argument I would make, and the reason why I was hesitant to endorse the proposition that I am a special case, is that if one were to, say, go back in time and find my family and me in one of the shelters in which we were living when I was 7, one would not have said that I was a special case then. It was the fact that there were communities and people who invested in me and who made that investment as I got older in spite of their knowledge that I had an anomalous status situation that made me into the person I am today. So in order for the undocumented, many of whom already to contribute massively to American society, to be in a position to contribute more, to make more out of their talents and opportunities, we need the same kind of investment to take place. But this will require that folks open themselves up to the possibility of going beyond the strictures of what is the law or what is viewed to be the law, and to think very seriously about what their ethical and moral responsibilities are to people who are in situations of extreme deprivation.
Well, Donnell, thank you for being on the program.
Oh, my pleasure.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on YouTube and WHUT.org. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.